Hello everyone, my name is Leah and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing episode 1, part 1. I don't know what to call this yet. Let's say episode 1. Today I'm going to be doing episode 1 in a Sapphic Reads series that I'm starting on my channel where I talk about every Sapphic book that I've ever read. I was really inspired to do this series a couple months ago because there are a lot of discussions on Twitter going around about there not really being any female books or people not knowing about female books. So I really wanted to bring attention to all of the Sapphic books that I read. And not all of these will be female romances, but they're all books that have Sapphic main characters. There are a lot more books I've read that have some Sapphic side characters that aren't really the focus of the book, but I wanted to specifically talk about books with Sapphic main characters. This video isn't going to be every Sapphic book I've ever read because that would be a very long video. This is definitely the first part of a series, so I'm only going to talk about 12 books in this video. I think every video in this series will probably be me talking about 10 to 12 books in order to keep them a little bit shorter. So definitely if you like this video, keep an eye out because I will be releasing more of these in the future and I'm really excited for these. I've also noticed someone else doing a Sapphic Reads series, Teresa from A Reading Elf, I think is what her channel is called, so I'll link that down below, because it's always great to have more creators talking about Sapphic books. Also, the first few books on this list are books that I read quite a few years ago, so I don't necessarily remember a lot about them. And I also can't necessarily speak to how good the rep was because I read it so long ago that I wasn't really aware of a lot of things then. So definitely do your own research into these books first and look at some other reviews of them and see what other people thought of the rep in them. The first book that I'm going to talk about is Beauty Queens by Libba Bray. This book is a contemporary YA and it follows a bunch of beauty queens whose plane crashes and lands on a desert island, and they have to kind of learn to survive and deal with a lot of adventures there. I think I read this in like 2016, so honestly, I don't remember that much about it. I remember that I thought it was cute and fun, but I didn't necessarily love it. It's definitely, I think, my least favorite of the Libba Bray books I've read, but I didn't dislike it. There are several main characters as the book follows several of the different beauty queens, and one of them is a lesbian and one of them is trans. The next book that I'm going to talk about is The Abyss Surrounds Us by Emily Skrutsky? I might be saying her name wrong. This is a YAFF sci-fi. The main character of this book, Cass, has grown up raising and training these sea monsters called Reckoners, and Reckoners protect ships because in this world there's a lot of travel between locations and trade and things like that that involve ships. So Reckoners are these sea monsters that people use to protect their ships. Cass ends up getting kidnapped by a group of pirates who wants her to train a Reckoner for them so they can use it for their ship. There's also an FF enemies to lovers romance with this, and the premise really appeals to me, but honestly, I didn't end up loving this book. However, I think I'm like the only Sapphic person I've come across that didn't like this book, so don't let that stop you from reading it. There are so many people I've seen love this book. I just didn't particularly like it myself, and I can't really remember all of the reasons I didn't like it because I read it 3 or 4 years ago now. I don't think I was really a fan of the writing, and I don't think I really loved the relationship either, but it's Sapphic enemies to lovers and a lot of people have liked it. I actually think Teresa from A Reading Elf, who I mentioned earlier, talked about it in her Sapphic Read series, so you should go check that out for someone who has a different opinion from me on the book. If you've read this and didn't like it, especially if you're Sapphic, please let me know, because I seem to be the only Sapphic person I know who's read this and didn't like it, and I want to talk to someone else who didn't like it. But even if you liked it, let me know. I like hearing about people who had different opinions on books than I did. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Everything Leads to You by Nina LaCour. This is a YAFF contemporary romance between two lesbians, and it was really cute. I also love the cover, it's so pink and cute. This book follows a girl named Emmy who is a film set designer, and I thought that aspect was really interesting looking at the set design, and it's something that I want to know more about. I also want to reread this and see what I think of like the set design aspects now, because although I don't work in film, I do work in theater, so there is some crossover there. Emmy ends up finding a letter from a celebrity who's recently died, and the letter is addressed to his granddaughter named Ava, and Emmy ends up going on a little journey to try to track her down. So it's about that, and it's about a romance, and cute contemporary things. I remember this being cute, but I really want to reread this now that it's been a few years and see what I think of it, because I did think it was cute, but I remember I wasn't blown away by it. But I do think that this is a good sapphic romance. Also, now that I know for sure I'm sapphic, I want to read it, because I think I read this before I was completely out to myself, and so I really want to see what I think of it now. Also, I wanted to read for you guys this snippet of a review that I found on Goodreads for this book, because choices were made. Emmy and Ava are both nice girls and characters. The coincidence of them both being lesbian made this book unfortunately not so realistic. I mean, I believe in fate and destiny from time to time, but this is too much. If she were bi, then maybe this book would have been more realistic. What? Why? The next book that I'm going to talk about is The You Have Never Known by Ellen Hopkins. This is a YA contemporary that's told in verse. It's told in alternating viewpoints between Ariel, who is bisexual, and Maya. I remember enjoying this, but I don't know how I feel about it now. I honestly can't really remember much about the story except, like, I think a plot twist that happens. I don't really remember anything specific other than that in the story, so I definitely can't speak right now on how the rep is or if I recommend it, but I wanted to talk in this video about every sapphic book I've read, so I still wanted to talk about this book. A funny story about me reading this book is that when I was reading it, or right after I had read it at the time, I told one of my friends about the bisexual rep in it. I was so excited about the bisexual rep that actually before I came out to her as bi, she already thought I was bi because of that. Also, at that point, I don't think I was even officially out to myself yet. The next book I'm going to talk about is Ash by Malinda Lo. This is a YAFF fantasy, and it's a lesbian Cinderella retelling, and this is another case of I love the concept, but I honestly wasn't really that much of a fan of the book itself, and I kind of found it a little boring. However, I've seen a lot of people really enjoy it, and the idea of a lesbian Cinderella retelling is just so good. I do really want to try to read some other Malinda Lo. I want to try to read Huntress by her, and I want to try to read Adaptation. I have it on my shelf. Hold on. My Funko Pop is blocking my view, so I can't see what the title is. Adaptation. Okay. I really want to also try reading Adaptation by her because I own that book. So I haven't given up on Malinda Lo, and I really want to try her books out in the future because they are such a staple of sapphic books. So I definitely have not given up on her books, and you will likely see more of her books in my Sapphic Reads videos in the future. The next book that I want to talk about is Windwitch by Susan Dennard, and this also applies to other books going forward in this series, which is the Witchland series. This is book 2, and book 2 introduces the point of view of one of my favorite characters of the series. I love her so much. She's so interesting, and she's queer, and she's such a fascinating character, and I'm also pretty sure hopeful that she's going to get into a female-female romance later on in the series. We'll see, because there's still a couple more books. I think the next book is coming out next year, and I'm very excited because I love this series. It's action-packed fantasy with really great nuanced characters and friendship and relationship development, and I just love it so much. And the character who gets added in this book, if you've read the series, come talk to me about her because she's so interesting. I love her. She's great. One thing I just want to comment on for this book is that it is not own voices. A lot of the books I'll talk about in this video are own voices, and I'll try to specify when they're not. Also, Beauty Queens by Libba Bray I don't think is own voices, but every other book so far the authors have been queer. The next book I want to talk about is Meet Cute, Some People Are Destined to Meet, and this is a YA contemporary anthology of short stories by different authors. They're all short romance stories about meet cutes between different couples. Not all of the stories are sapphic, but there is a female-female short story by Nina LaCour, who wrote Everything Leads to You, and there's also, I believe, 2 other female-female short stories in there. This was cute, but I myself am not a huge fan of short story anthologies just because there's always a couple that I love, and then several that I just think are okay, and then a couple that I really don't like. So short story collections really tend to be a mixed bag for me. I think that's especially the case when it's a short story collection that involves a lot of different authors like this one does. I apologize if my camera angle has changed. I'm using my phone since my camera SD card is almost full and my phone just fell. So, hopefully it did not change too much. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Leah on the Offbeat by Becky Albertalli, and this is a FFYA contemporary. This is another book that is not on Voices. This is a spin-off of Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda that follows one of the side characters of that book, Leah, who is bisexual and plus-sized. I liked parts of this, but it is my least favorite of the Becky Albertalli books that I've read, and I had some problems with it that are kind of spoilery, so I'll try to talk about them in a vague way. I don't want to get too in-depth with it, but one of the characters made some statements to another character about sexuality that rubbed me the wrong way. I know some bi people who think the rep in this is harmful, and I know some bi people who really enjoyed this book, so definitely look at reviewers from other bi people who've read this book and see what they think. It's also been a while since I've read this book, so I can't talk too much about the rep. I wrote some notes on what was said, so I'm going to be looking down a little bit during this. One of the characters is talking to the main character, Leah, about how it's really weird that she has the same name as me but written differently. One of the characters is talking to the main character about how she's kind of questioning her sexuality and how she thinks that she's low-key bi, and Leah has a problem with how she says that and says, low-key bi, a little bit bi, just be bi, like come on. I didn't really appreciate this conversation because people get to decide their labels for themselves, and other people should not be policing people's labels like this. And also, as someone who questioned their sexuality for a very long time and spent a while saying, oh, I might be bi, but I'm not sure, or I think I'm bi, reading this wasn't really fun because questioning is a real thing and can be very difficult for people and can take a really long time. So you shouldn't say something like that to someone who says they're low-key bi, because this character was questioning their sexuality and trying to figure things out, and I just really didn't like that aspect of it. Like I said, I do know bi people who have liked this book, so definitely check out some other reviews if you're thinking about picking this one up. The next book I'm going to talk about is Queer There and Everywhere, 23 People Who Changed the World. This is by Sarah Prager, and this is a nonfiction book about 23 queer people throughout history. This focuses on people from many different identities, but there are several sapphic people talked about in this book. This book did include some people of color, but I felt like it could have been a little bit more diverse and included some people from more locations than they did. I'm also interested in reading more nonfiction like this, so if you've read anything like this with queer characters, but especially sapphic characters, please let me know in the comments down below. Another thing about this book is that it talks about historical figures that the author is interpreting as queer, but that we don't know for 100% certain that they're queer, and I think from what I remember that the author discusses that in the book, so definitely keep that in mind if you're going to check this book out. I would also say that the writing of this book is more geared towards preteens and teens, and I don't know that I'd really enjoy it now if I read it, but I did enjoy it at the time that I read it. The next book is Queens of Geek by Jen Wilde. This is a YA contemporary, and there are two main characters, Charlie and Taylor. Charlie is bisexual, and she's a vlogger and an actress, and recently had a very public breakup with her co-star named Reese. She ends up going to a con, and while at the con, she finds out that there's an actress that she's had a crush on for a while who is a surprise guest at the con, and she gets to interact with her. Charlie is bisexual, and the other main character, Taylor, isn't sapphic, but I did want to talk about her for just a second, because Taylor is plus-sized and also has Asperger's and anxiety, and that's focused on a lot in the book, and I especially liked reading about the anxiety rep. I would definitely say if you have anxiety, reading about it can be a little difficult, because sometimes reading about anxiety can make you anxious, which is definitely something that I experienced reading this book, but I really, really liked reading it. I really enjoyed reading this book. It was very cute. It had great rep. I will say it was a little bit cheesy, but I didn't really care that much because it was just adorable and I loved the rep in it. The next book is Annie on My Mind by Nancy Gardner, and this is a very classic lesbian coming-of-age romance story that probably a lot of people have heard of. This is an older book, and I know for a lot of people this has been like the first lesbian book that they've read, and so it's been a really important book to a lot of people. And though it wasn't the first lesbian book I read, this was very, very meaningful for me, and I cried a lot reading it. The main character of this book's name is Liza, and she falls for a girl named Annie. This book is about two girls falling in love and also having to deal with a lot of pressures from their family and from their school when certain things happen in the book. One thing I really want to specify for this book is that several of the books I'm talking about definitely have trigger warnings for homophobia or being outed, but I really want to emphasize those for this book because they are such a major part of the book, so definitely be wary if that's something that's going to affect you going into this book. I'm also going to put trigger warnings in the description box down below, so I may have forgotten to mention something for a previous book. So if you're someone who wants to know trigger warnings ahead of time, definitely look down at my description box. The last book that I'm going to talk about today is Dreadnought by April Daniels, which is the first book in the Nemesis duology. I think it's a duology. I want to continue on with this, but I haven't yet, so probably at some point in the future you will see the second book in a Sapphic Reads video of mine. This is a YA superhero book with a trans lesbian protagonist. The main character's name is Danny, and after this really famous superhero named Dreadnought dies in front of her, Dreadnought's powers end up getting transferred to her, which for a lot of people would be really, really cool because you get superpowers. But one thing about these powers is that it means transforming Danny's body into the body that she's always wanted, and this forces her to out herself to her family because her body now reflects what she's always wanted it to look like. There are a lot of superhero adventures in this book, and Danny also has to deal with a lot of transphobia, especially from her family, but also with other characters throughout. So there are very definite trigger warnings for transphobia and also transphobic slurs throughout this book. Alright, that's going to be it for episode 1 of my Sapphic Reads series. I'm really excited to continue talking to all of you about all of the Sapphic books that I've read. If you've read any of these, please let me know what you think in the comments down below. And also, if you haven't and this video has inspired you to add any of these to your TBR, please let me know. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you later. This is another one that is not unfolded. That fell, not my phone falling. Off following. Oh my God, Jesus Christ. Okay. This book